Wow, everybody just popping in all at once. That's amazing to see the room populate like that. So welcome. So you all know me already. My name is Ann Albert. I'm the Clapp Family Director for Public Programs at the Cat Center. We are in our fifth, which means next to last lecture in our sixth session mini course on Jews in American Mass Media with Dr. Ayelet Brinn. Today's lecture is on Jews, race and Hollywood. Is that how I got it right? Hollywood, race and religion, sorry. And I know some of you have done some readings, maybe even watched a little bit of The Jazz Singer before today. So I don't have any other logistics or business to talk about except just the quick reminder to keep yourselves muted. And at the times, feel free to put questions or comments in the chat and I'll try to raise them. And I think we'll have some specific discussion or Q&A sections and I'll moderate that. Ayelet.
Okay, great. I'll share my screen and then I'll get started. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Today, we're going to be focusing on the birth of Hollywood and the different things that this subject can tell us about Jewish identity and about popular culture in this period. So for most of the lecture, I'll be focusing in on one movie, The Jazz Singer, which was the first feature-length motion picture to incorporate a synchronized score and some synchronized speech and singing. So as you saw, if you watched it, it's actually a bit of a composite movie with title cards and silent film aspects and only really a few minutes of actual dialogue, not all of which is perfectly synced. It's a really fascinating film in many ways and very groundbreaking. There have been a couple of different attempts to revive or reconceive it. So 3 TV and film remakes, as well as a few radio remakes. But in other ways, not all aspects of the film have aged particularly well. So I'm hoping some of you were able to watch the film before our lecture today or have seen it in the past, or were able to interact with others of the suggested materials for this week. But as always, I'll make sure to incorporate enough background so that the lecture is accessible to those who didn't have a chance to do so. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them out in the chat. So we'll be talking about the film itself quite a bit and how it picks up on themes we've been discussing over the course of the last few weeks together, whether acculturation means giving up Jewish particularity in order to assimilate or finding ways to balance Jewish and American identities, generational tensions, how pop culture both reflects and furthers these conversations. But we'll also use the film as a prism to explore the relationship of Jews and Jewishness to early Hollywood, the relationship of Hollywood to previous cultural forms, and the interrelationship of religion, race, and culture. And the behind-the-scenes story of the film, as well as the plot of the film itself, provide fascinating windows into all of these issues. So I'll be drawing here from the film, as well as some of the materials used in the 1920s to promote the film, which are reprinted in Chandler and Hoberman's book, which some of you read excerpts from today. So just a quick note before we begin, I'll be showing some images and clips of actors in blackface in this lecture, because I think it's important for understanding the film and for understanding American popular culture in this time period. And I'll also be quoting some anti-Semitic propaganda by Henry Ford to describe certain stereotypes about Jews that existed in the 1920s around the time the film was produced. So some people might find these images or discussions upsetting, and I wanted to give everyone a heads up before we began. So I'll start by giving a brief summary of the plot of the movie itself, and we'll add more layers of context and complexity as we go along, but since not everyone necessarily got a chance to watch the film, I'll just want to give a broad summary of the plot. So The Jazz Singer tells the story of Jakey Rabinowitz, who's torn between his traditional Jewish family and his budding entertainment career. He's the son of a cantor on New York's Lower East Side and runs away from home as a young boy after being beaten by his father for performing in music halls. The movie then shifts ahead by about a decade or so, and Jakey Rabinowitz has become Jack Robin, who's a budding vaudeville entertainer. He falls in love with a dancer and gets his first big break in a new musical review. He then goes to visit his family on the Lower East Side for the first time in over a decade and tries to explain to his parents his love for modern music and entertainment. His mother is sympathetic, but his father is really not. As Jack is preparing for the opening of his new show, his mother visits, telling him that his father is dying and that he needs to come home to sing Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur in his father's place, which would conflict with the opening night for his show. In the end, Jack decides to chant Kol Nidre as his father dies peacefully, and the film ends with Jack having achieved vaudeville stardom and being reunited with his mother, who is shown in the audience of his performance. The film was based on a short story by Samson Raphaelson called The Day of Atonement, which was first adapted into a play called The Jazz Singer, then into the film. The play was somewhat of a success on Broadway, though according to contemporary accounts, most of the audience who went were Jews, and contemporary reviews, especially in the Jewish press, talked about being unsure of whether the play had a wider appeal than this Jewish audience. So that's something to keep in mind when we're discussing the film, thinking through how different audiences might have received the film version of The Jazz Singer. In the promotional materials for the film, the producers included an essay by Raphaelson discussing how he came to write the short story The Jazz Singer was based on. I'll summarize it briefly for you. The text is pretty small here, and then I'll read out an excerpt. In the way that Raphaelson tells the origin story, he was a college student at the University of Illinois and decided to take a date to see a performance of a play called Robinson Crusoe Jr. The production starred Al Jolson, who was then a huge vaudeville star. This was his first time seeing Jolson perform, and he was immediately mesmerized. So this is a quote from that essay. So, quote, "I shall never forget the first 5 minutes of Jolson, his velocity, the amazing fluidity with which he shifted from a tremendous absorption in his audience to a tremendous absorption in his song. I still remember the song, Where the Black-Eyed Susans Grow. When he finished, I turned to the girl beside me, dazed with memories of my childhood on the East Side, memories of the Pike Street Synagogue. I said to the girl, 'My God, this isn't a jazz singer, this is a cantor.' I went backstage after the performance and I talked to Jolson. He told me a little of his background, but I had already guessed it. I knew there was a spirit of cantors in him, the blood of cantors in him." So viewing this performance inspired Raphaelson to write the short story, The Day of Atonement, around the theme of a cantor's son who wants to become an entertainer, which then formed the basis of the play and later the movie. So I'm curious to hear what strikes you about this description. What connections is he making? What questions does it raise? And as always, I'll ask you to type your responses into the chat, and Anne has graciously agreed to read them out.
Just giving people a few minutes to ruminate and type. Okay, so the first comment from Richard is that the girl that he goes to the show with seems to be not Jewish.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. He doesn't mention in the story whether she's Jewish or not. But you think because it's talking about his background from a sort of explaining it perspective, is that why you think she's not Jewish?
Yeah, Richard, yeah.
So that's interesting because that reflects some of the plot of the actual film itself.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so Amy is saying it's funny that she doesn't think of cantors as being attentive to the audience. So this particular comment about connecting Jolson to cantorial traditions doesn't seem so apt. So maybe that role has changed over time, or maybe it was different in the synagogues that he was used to.
Yeah, I would imagine it's different in different congregations as well. But that's interesting that he has a certain understanding of what a cantor's role is that might not be universal. So what he's picking up on might not be something universally Jewish, but something about his particular experience of Jewish life.
Right. And Judith is asking if Jolson himself would have appreciated this association or this kind of characterization of the way that he performed.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. That's a really good question. Are there any other comments before I move on to that discussion, or?
So there's a little more discussion of whether the girl that goes with him is Jewish, because she seems to understand the context for what a cantor is. So maybe. Elias says there's a tension in the idea that a cantor is a profession passed down from family to family. That seems like a more traditional idea of one's role in the community versus secular stardom. That's just based on.
That's interesting. So the idea of what training one gets in one of those professions versus the other, there is a
And
tension
what
there.
qualifies you. So to become a star, it's just your talent, but to become a
Mhm.
cancer, it's your background.
Yeah. So to add two more layers to the discussion, one thing that I picked up when I was reading this is the idea that to him, jazz music and Ashkenazi cantorial music have similarities. So one of the things he talks about, which is going to become a theme in the film, is the idea of similarities musically between these two genres. And I'll talk about that a little more later on. But then in the end, he talks a little bit about Jolson's biography and how Jolson's biography, not just his performance, is one of the things that inspired the plot. So I'll talk a little bit about that here now. So one thing he's really trying to highlight in this description were parallels between the plot of the film, or first the short story, then the play, then the film, and details of the life of the star of the film version, Al Jolson. So Jolson was an incredibly popular star in the early 20th century. He was often called the world's greatest entertainer. He got his start in traveling vaudeville shows before eventually moving on to Broadway and film. He was born as Asa Joelson in what is now Lithuania in around 1886. The records are a little fuzzy. Some say as early as 1883. His father came to the US in the 1890s. His mother and four siblings came a few years later. The whole family moved to Washington, D.C., where his father worked as a cantor and as a rabbi. So unlike in the movie, where Jakey Rabinowitz's father wants him to become a cantor, according to many sources, it seems like Jolson's father did not want him to become a cantor. He thought it wasn't a career path with a lot of prospects. But he also wasn't excited about the idea of his son going into show business. He thought there were more respectable pathways for entertainment, including performers in classical music orchestras and things like that. But the producers of The Jazz Singer really tried to find ways to make this meta history really explicit. This would have been something that some audiences would have known about. And they're really trying to play up Jolson's fame as part of the appeal of the movie. And this was not just in the promotional materials like what we just saw, but also in the film itself. So this is the title card that the audience sees right after the movie shifts ahead by a decade. So when he goes from a child to an adult. So it says, Jakey Rabinowitz had become Jack Robin, the cantor's son, a jazz singer, but fame was still an uncaptured bubble. Al Jolson. So this is the first time we see Al Jolson on screen. And so the audience is primed to think of what's going on, both in terms of the plot and supposed to be seeing Al Jolson as Al Jolson at the same time. So it's working on both of those levels at the same time. So like Jakey in the movie, Asa Joelson and his brother ran away from home when he was around 11, and they ended up working in vaudeville, traveling around to different theaters, singing and dancing. Eventually, they changed their names from Asa and Hirsch Joelson to Al and Harry Jolson. And he eventually became a huge star. By the 1920s, he was one of the highest paid entertainers in America. And in the Encyclopedia of Popular Culture's entry on him, they say, quote, Jolson was to jazz, blues, and ragtime what Elvis Presley was to rock and roll. So what do you think that means? If anyone has any thoughts about that quotation, please type it out into the chat box. What questions does that raise?
While we're waiting, I'll just point out that there was one final comment on our previous discussion, which I think will probably be relevant to discussions of race. Richard pointed out that spirit, and so in terms of what qualifies you to work in different kinds of performance, spirit and blood seem like stand-ins for Jewishness. So you might try to pass, but it's something innate. So there's something.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so Amy points out that in both cases, in response to your question, in both cases, they're translators of Black music and culture to the white masses.
Yes. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the things, or maybe even the main thing that's going on in that quotation. And that's really important for understanding the jazz singer, as well as for understanding Al Jolson's career. So he's most famous for being one of the most successful blackface performers of his era. And like many vaudeville and Broadway performers of his time, he also borrowed heavily from musical styles that were pioneered by Black musicians, including jazz and ragtime. So this is an image of what Jolson looked like in Robinson Crusoe Jr. So what he would have looked like to Rafelson in the 1910s when he went to the show that inspired him to write the short story that became The Jazz Singer. So blackface is one of the first forms of popular culture that was created in America, and it has a long, complicated history. I can only give bare details now in our short lecture. It began somewhere around the 1830s, but became especially popular after the Civil War. It was mostly white performers, though eventually also Black performers, putting cork or shoe polish on their faces, exaggerating the outlines of their mouths in order to pretend to be Black. These performances played on various racial stereotypes, and it also usually involved some amount of singing and dancing and bands in the performance. They became incredibly popular through minstrel shows and later vaudeville, which were both forms of variety theater with a mix of different kinds of acts. They were pioneered in the North and then eventually were popular throughout the rest of the country. This is actually the origin of the term Jim Crow, which was the name of a blackface character created by Thomas Dartmouth Rice. So there are different reasons people cite for why blackface was so popular in American culture throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Some see it as a way to process racial tension or a way to feel less bad about something that was at that very moment tearing the country apart. So the birth of minstrelsy is in the period right before the Civil War. So some see it as an attempt to use art to think through or to trivialize something that was really tearing the nation apart at this time. Others see it as a way of consolidating white people or for immigrants to claim a sense of whiteness by sort of taking on the racism of American culture. In the early 20th century, it started to take on new valences for other people. For some, it was a way to process fears of industrialization, because often minstrelsy was talking about an imagined Southern past that was seen as agrarian, and therefore it was a nostalgia for a time before industrialization had ruined American society. So in thinking about Al Jolson, the jazz singer and blackface, it's important to keep in mind how prevalent blackface was at this time. This was really a central component of American popular culture. So most performers at the turn of the 20th century who were very famous performed at least sometimes in blackface. Judy Garland, Eddie Cantor, Sophie Tucker. And eventually many African Americans did so as well as a way to break into show business, as did many Jewish performers as a way to break into show business, including Jolson. And he became particularly notable for his performances in in blackface, sorry. And this was also central to early movie and cartoon history. So blackface performance was part of Birth of a Nation, which was the first full-length film. And there are also many who say that Mickey Mouse is himself based on Al Jolson and how he looked in blackface. Here's an image of the two of them next to each other. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. So different performers emphasize different things when performing in blackface. Some were much more subversive, for example, using the form to question racism. But even so, it's important to keep in mind that the stereotypes embodied in the stock characters of blackface, minstrelsy, played a significant role in cementing and growing racist images, attitudes, and perceptions worldwide. So by the mid 20th century, this was much less common in popular culture, though it didn't fully disappear. And it has recently become a topic of public conversation again because of several cases of evidence surfacing of prominent politicians and media figures wearing blackface or brownface. So when we're discussing the film, this is one set of context to keep in mind. The way the film mirrors or plays on the facts of Al Jolson's life, the way it exemplifies the prominence of blackface in popular culture at this time, the ways it exemplifies a longer history of appropriating Black culture in order to popularize it, and the ways in which Jewish performers took part in this larger cultural trend, but also sometimes discussed it in ways that were particular to Jewish culture. So drawing connections, for example, between jazz or ragtime and Ashkenazi cantorial music. So now I want to lay out a second set of context to consider when thinking about the jazz singer, which is Jews in the beginning of Hollywood. So The Jazz Singer was one of the first major productions by Warner Brothers, which was then a young, not really established movie studio. At the time, it was best known for movies starring the dog Rin Tin Tin, and they had also begun experimenting with synchronizing sound and video. So the history of Warner Brothers Studio and the Warner Brothers themselves, and especially their Jewish background, also became integral in the promotional materials for The Jazz Singer. So this essay that we have on the screen right now, like Rafelson's essay I quoted before, was from a souvenir booklet given out at the premiere of The Jazz Singer, and it's reprinted in Chandler and Hoberman's book. So I'll summarize it and then I'll read out an excerpt that I'm curious to hear your thoughts again. So in this essay, the Warner Brothers frame the history of the studio through the lens of immigration and the American dream. So their father, Benjamin, who you see on one side of the essay, left Poland for America in the 1880s, searching for opportunity. He opened up a small store in Baltimore and then sent over for his wife and family. The family moved around before eventually settling in Ohio, and his son soon became enraptured with the new technology of motion pictures. The brothers chipped in together and bought a copy of the early Edison film, The Great Train Robbery, and began staging showings of it. After some trial and error, the Warner Brothers eventually opened up a successful chain of movie houses, and they eventually began producing films as well, which is how the Warner Brothers studio was born. So at the end of the essay, they shift back to focusing specifically on the production of The Jazz Singer. So this is how they frame that account. Quote, as it was found fitting to open this sketch with a reference to Benjamin Warner, it should be fitting to close it with further reference. What became of him as his boys grew to manhood? That he should have gone into motion pictures seems only natural, and for years he proudly guided the destiny of a cozy theater in Niles, Ohio. It was only the other day that he agreed to retire. Then, with his wife, he went to Hollywood. Unobtrusively, he moved through the Warner Brothers studio during the filming of The Jazz Singer. Once there rose some question of the authenticity of a ghetto scene, i.e. a scene filmed on the Lower East Side. He quietly settled it, and from that moment, his presence was felt and his advice welcomed. From that point, Mr. Warner practically became a technical director of the picture, and much of the charm of the home and the ghetto scenes is due to his suggestions. Always eager to listen to their father, the Warners are more eager to do so today than ever. So while the public only knows of 4 Warners, there are really 5, including the quiet figure that takes so much interest in everything bearing the announcement Warner Brothers presents. So again, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What stands out to you about this description? Why might they include this essay in their souvenir booklet for the movie? And again, please type your responses into the chat and I'll ask Anne to read some of them out to me.
Okay, so Larry points out that he stood for the authenticity of the immigrant experience that the film really represents.
Yes, they're making a claim for the authenticity of the movie and saying that the fact that their father was there is one of the reasons why they were able to make it authentic. Definitely.
But is there a contradiction there because he wasn't from the ghetto? He had been living in Niles, Ohio.
It's a good question. Depends probably on who you ask. I guess some people would say that all of the immigrants enclaves in different cities had a similar vibe, and others would say this is sort of showing the seams of this American dream story that they're trying to create.
Right, so other people are saying similar things. The message reassures Jewish audience in particular that it's authentic and also tells non-Jewish audiences that it's really Jewish.
Interesting. So it's working on multiple levels to different audiences. I think that's definitely true.
And Miriam points out that it also stresses the importance of family to the Warner Brothers and tries to make them appealing as sort of family-oriented figures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are all really great points. Is there anything else, or should I go from there?
I mean, I think that's the gist of what most of the comments are.
Yeah, I think this is a really rich text that gives us a lot to go on. So some of the things that stand out to me in particular that touch on things that you've already mentioned are the use of the opportunity of the film's opening to tell the origin story of the Warner Brothers themselves. So the movie itself is sort of an origin story, and so trying to sort of mimic that within the description of Warner Brothers. In particular, they're highlighting their heritage as Jewish immigrants and using it to bolster the authenticity of the movie, which we discussed. And the father-son relationship is really central here, which is also a central theme of the film. But instead of fathers and sons representing fraught tensions over degrees of acculturation, this essay actually reframes it as a much more mutually beneficial relationship. The father not only supports his son's careers in Hollywood, but is also able to bring his quote unquote authenticity to bear to further their careers. So the fact that the Warner Brothers use their own life stories to market the film makes it a great avenue into discussing changes in the film industry at the turn of the 20th century and the rise of Hollywood. So often now we use Hollywood as a shorthand for most American mass-produced major commercial motion pictures, but Hollywood was not the center of motion picture industry from the beginning, nor were Jewish filmmakers involved from the very beginning. So the producers of the earliest films were Men like Thomas Edison, who were not Jewish. This continued to be true through the 1910s with directors like D.W. Griffith, who wrote Birth of a Nation. As we discussed a few weeks ago, when viewing some of Edison's early films, Jews and other immigrant groups, as well as African Americans, were subjects, often stereotyped subjects, of early films and were keen viewers of early films, but were not really involved in the production at this stage, or at least at the highest levels of production. But a very large percentage of those who turned it into a major mass industry with a diverse audience, mainly centered in Hollywood, were Jewish. So the Warners were part of this larger early generation of Hollywood studio executives, many of whom were Jewish. Louis B. Mayer, one of the founders of MGM, Warner Brothers, David O. Selznick, who ran Paramount, MGM, RKO at various times. He also directed Gone with the Wind and many other films. Irving Thalberg, who was involved in Universal and MGM. Again, Jewishness was something that mattered more to some of these men than others, but all of them were of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. So there are several reasons that people cite for why Jews were overrepresented in the film industry in this period. So some cite the fact that many Eastern European immigrants came over with a deep belief in America and the American dream. For many, this ideal was quickly thwarted, so they were attracted to the fantasy and wish fulfillment element of film, and they saw it as a way to revive this dream and create a more perfect vision of America. So that's one set of arguments. Another points to much more practical explanations. The fact that Jewish entrepreneurs had already become part of Broadway and vaudeville, and there was overlap between these worlds. Or conversely, the fact that many Jews got their financial start in trade, manufacturing, and the garment industry. So for shop owners and garment makers, it was crucial to figure out people's tastes and cater goods and services accordingly. So that's a skill set that's also very applicable in the entertainment industry. Or others say that film and other forms of entertainment are, in many ways, a commodity, somewhat similar to shorts or pants or shirts or dry goods. And so it's another sort of good to figure out how to market. And some even opened their first movie houses inside already existing dry goods stores or other sorts of stores. So as we saw a few weeks ago, many future Jewish film entrepreneurs started by opening local theaters on the Lower East Side or in other immigrant neighborhoods throughout the country, which were incredibly popular. Many young people also got their start working in film in various capacities on a lower level and in movie theaters over time, and then eventually shifted over from running picture houses and distributing films to make their own films. And then that's when they moved out to Hollywood and the rise of Hollywood was born. So other people also point to the fact that new industries like the entertainment industry, especially film, provided easier pathways to upward mobility than industries that had quotas for Jews that required higher education in this period. So the fact that Jews were so overrepresented in early Hollywood led to various anti-Semitic tropes over the years about Jews in Hollywood. And like many anti-Semitic tropes, the rhetoric was not always consistent. So in the 1920s, with the rise of nativism, some pointed to Jewish involvement in Hollywood as a sign that all Jews were cynical capitalists. Others saw it as a sign that all Jews were immoral or dangerous and radical politically, and therefore that it might seep into their films in some way. So these conversations continued as the years went by and took on different valences over time. So in the 1930s, with the advent of the Hollywood codes, there was a focus on both the perceived radicalism of Jews and on whether Jewish film producers were up to the moral standards that Hollywood should project. Later on in the decade, there were also fears that Jewish film producers would force the US into World War II through propaganda films. In the post-war period, there were fears about Jewish filmmakers, especially screenwriters, as espousing communism in some way in their films. And at the turn of the 21st century, there was rhetoric centered around Jews in Hollywood as centers of the liberal elite, and that their perceived interests disconnected with those of everyday life in America. So many of these rhetorical strategies relied on long-standing Jewish stereotypes, Jews as overly ambitious, too reliant on modern technology, or too unreliant on modern technology, overly good at financial matters, overly competitive and crass. So this is one example from around the time that the Jazz Singer was being produced. So this is by Henry Ford. Quote, "When you see millions of people crowding through the doors of the movie houses at all hours of the day and night, it is worth knowing who draws them there, who acts upon their minds while they quiescently wait in the darkened theater, And who really controls this massive bulk of human force and ideas generated and directed by the suggestions of the screen? Who stands at the apex of this mountain of control? It is stated in the sentence: the motion picture influence in the United States and Canada is exclusively under the control, moral and financial, of the Jewish manipulators of the public mind. Jews did not invent the art of motion photography. They have contributed next to nothing to its mechanical or technical improvement. They had not produced any of the great artists, either writers or actors, which have furnished the screen with its material. Motion photography, like most other useful things in the world, is of non-Jewish origin. But by the singular destiny which has made the Jews the great cream skimmers of the world, the benefit of it has gone not to the originators, but to the usurpers, the exploiters. So this article put forward Ford's fears about the influence exerted by film producers on their audiences. He also played on long-standing tropes against Jews, that they weren't innovators or producers, but instead took advantage of other people's inventions for their own gains and applied those older rhetoric to newer technology like film. So right around the time that The Jazz Singer was released, many filmmakers and studio executives who were of Jewish descent began making movies like The Jazz Singer that were explicitly about the immigrant experience. These were often silent movies that emphasized the seamless integration of new immigrants into American society. So one interesting way to think about The Jazz Singer is through the prism of the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitism, and new immigrant quotas in the 1920s. And the happy ending of the movie is less about what the filmmakers saw as the truth of the American Jewish experience in this period, and more about hopes for how it could be or maybe should be. This has also led some to criticize the film as painting an overly rosy image of acculturation. So at the end of the film, Jack Robin is able to have it all. He has a successful career, his mother's love, his non-Jewish love interest, his father's approval before he passes away. But there are criticisms that the tension in the movie is also very internal, that the only question is whether he can balance tradition and change for himself, not whether he as a Jew will be accepted into mainstream society. No sense that he might have faced pushback, not just from his father for giving up tradition, but from arbiters of popular culture. So some people read these movies, including The Jazz Singer, as not only autobiographical about Jolson, but about studio executives like the Warners. So to quote from Hoberman and Chandler's discussion of the film, in The Jazz Singer, the Warner Brothers created a kind of collective self-portrait of their fellow moguls, in which traditional Judaism gave way to new American religions of show business. So in different cases, studio executives are more or less involved in the actual production of films. So any conversation about Hollywood and Jewish culture needs to keep in mind various people that take part in producing a film, as well as the role of audience reception in shaping how a film is read at the time and in retrospect. But since the Warners actively tried to highlight their personal relationship to the subject matter of the film, this is one important prism through which to analyze The Jazz Singer. This element was also played up in the release of the film, so not just in the promotional material we've read together so far, but also the opening night of the movie was the night before Yom Kippur, which is especially resonant given the film's plot centers around Yom Kippur. Interestingly, and pretty sadly, one of the Warner brothers, Sam Warner, died the night before the premiere at 40 years old, which in some ways echoes the plot of the film itself, where the father dies right at the climax of the film. So now we've set up various contexts through which to analyze The Jazz Singer, I want to turn to the film itself. So for those of you who watched it for this lecture or who have seen it previously, I'd like to start by hearing your thoughts. Some questions to consider. So what stood out to you about the film, either when you watched it now or when you've watched it in the past? What did you like or not like? What questions did it raise? What scenes did you find most memorable? Again, please type your responses into the chat for Anne to read out.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for that, I'll just point out that there has been some some additional discussion about Henry Ford and his anti-Semitism in the chat. So people want to have a look. People are saying some interesting things there. And just following up on something that you got to recently about the ways in which studio execs or other Jews in the entertainment industry also had to navigate a world where they might be rejected by the wider society. Betty Ruth had asked to talk a little bit about why so many Jews in theater and films changed their names to non-Jewish names, even had plastic surgery, married out of Judaism, in many ways left that heritage behind. So do you see it primarily as a way of kind of negotiating and managing acceptance, or is there some other phenomenon there too?
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time talking in sort of totalizing terms about these things. I would imagine there are lots of factors that go into these kind of decisions, and they're slightly different for different people. But for a lot of them, it is about trying to gain wider acceptance in American society, especially as film stars or as film executives. But it was also true that a lot of American Jews who were not in these industries also changed their names. So it's part of this broader discourse happening at this time too.
Okay, all right. So that bought us a little bit of time. We have the first the first comment about the jazz singer from Richard, that that at this stage of life, he says, "I'm much more aware of the odd Oedipal issues with the mother."
Yes.
And if you could also comment on the mother being a quote unquote immigrant mother stand-in and not limited to just Jewish.
Yes, that's a really interesting point. When I show this film to undergrads, that's the main thing that they bring up as well. There's a sort of romantic tension between him and his mother. And there are various ways that people have read that over time. So one is a sense that there are old tropes about Jewish men being especially connected to their mothers. So they're trying to play on those in some way. Conversely, other people read that as a way to try to sort of tamp down the sexual potency of Al Jolson. And so he has this inter-ethnic relationship at the center of the movie with a non-Jewish love interest. So if you see him through this Oedipal lens, it sort of tamps down on the danger of that plot line if people would see that as dangerous. One of the interesting things about the film and the production of the film is that the actors who play both the mother and the father are not of Jewish descent. So we read them as Jewish when reading the film, and that wasn't necessarily their own background. So it's true of Al Jolson, but wasn't true of everyone in the film.
So far, that's the only general response to the
Okay,
job.
great. So I want to start by showing the beginning few minutes of the film and discussing them together. So these are the title cards that the audience sees right before the film begins. It's a bit dark, so I'll read it out to you. So this is one. It says, "In every living soul, a spirit cries for expression. Perhaps this plaintive, wailing song of jazz is, after all, the misunderstood utterance of a prayer." So similar to the Rafelson essay that we saw before, they're making this explicit connection between jazz and cantorial music and trying to show that both not only are they similar in sound, but they're similar in sort of the emotions that they evoke. And that's a really important thing that they set up right from the beginning. And then they bring us right into what they call the New York ghetto, throbbing to that rhythm of music, which is older than civilization. So they're bringing up the idea of tradition and music as a way to talk about tradition and about modernity and change. So it's this major tension that they're setting up. So now I want to play you a clip of the first about minute and a half or so of the film and have us discuss it together. So if you're watching this lecture on YouTube, you'll notice that we removed the film clips for copyright reasons. So the clip I'm showing is the first minute and a half or so of the film, which depicts everyday life on the Lower East Side before going into the homes of the main characters. So I'll start playing the movie now. It seems like you won't be able to hear the sound, but there's no actual synchronized sound in this moment of the film. So I'll play the clip now. That's enough to show you how it sets up the major tensions of the film in the first couple of minutes. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this portion of the film, the opening title cards that I showed and the first minute or so of the film. So how does the film open? Why do you think it opens this way? What connections does the film set up? And what tensions does the film set up? And how does it set up those tensions?
Okay, so comments coming in quickly. So people are
Great.
pointing out that it sets up Jews as a race, not just as a tradition or religion.
And that was a pretty common trope at that time, to talk about Jews in racial terms. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually a bunch of different comments saying more or less the same thing, that it was very striking to people to have that really explicit right from the outset. Also pointing out that Jews weren't yet considered white.
So that's a complicated question. I would say in the 1920s, there are various different positions on the whiteness of Jews that are all happening at once. But for some people, definitely Jews were not considered white.
Betty Ruth is asking what year this was filmed.
So it came out in 1927. So I would imagine somewhere in that general area. I don't know if it was exactly 1927 for when it was filmed.
Okay. And Amy points out that the opening is very joyous. It's a very happy depiction of the immigrant experience of the Lower East Side.
Yeah, and if you listened to my lecture a couple of weeks ago, you'll notice there's somewhat of a similarity in the documentary stance of the first sort of 30 seconds of the film and one of the first Edison films we saw of a ghetto fish market. So there's sort of an idea that like you can use the beginning of the film to set up some sort of authentic understanding of what it's like to live on the Lower East Side. So they're doing something somewhat similar with film there.
Right.
Anything else you notice?
I'll give people one more minute and just say that, you know, one of the things that's striking to me is that kind of universalization that's right there in the first card, that the music is older than civilization. It's something that everyone has the same access to.
Right. So one thing that they're trying to do in this film is play on sort of like the tension and also the sort of coincidence of particularity and universality. And they're trying to make the film work on both of those levels at the same time. Yeah.
Right. And then Elias points out that it was possible to hear a little hint of Kol Nidre in the music.
Yes. Oh, could you hear the music?
We could actually, yeah.
Oh, good. We were having trouble with that during the prep session. So I'm glad that you could hear it. Yes. Yeah, they're trying to sort of evoke cantorial themes in the music itself and trying to sort of play up that.
And then as a counterpoint, Larry points out that that's also just the sound of classical music like Tchaikovsky. So it's not necessarily Kol Nidre, but rather there are different forms and traditions converging in our imagination.
And later on in the film, they do use Tchaikovsky. There's Romeo and Juliet is used at various times throughout the movie as well. And so both of those are actually playing up at the same time. And so that's also interesting in thinking about how we read the film versus how other people might read the film. The idea that we are seeing it as a Jewish sounding music, because that's the kinds of things they're trying to evoke, but it also might be that they're also evoking contemporary music, and they might also be evoking classical music at the same time.
So just one last comment from Mort and Carmi. They're struck by the anti-traditionality of the film, the stance of being against tradition.
Yes. So at least the beginning of the film sets up a pretty clear idea that the father's sort of fear of modernity and change is not a good thing. They're trying to say that the mother's approach of trying to embrace and sort of respect the son's interest in leading a modern life is the way of the future. So definitely there's a moralistic tone there.
Great.
Anything else?
Well, there's one just point of clarification. Judith is asking if the term ghetto was used to describe the Lower East Side in other places as well. And it seems like it was, right? It was a common.
Yes. Yeah, very, very common at this time, starting in the late 19th century to call the Lower East Side the ghetto or the Jewish ghetto, depending on which sources you're looking at.
All right, I think that's it.
Great. So there are lots of rich topics to explore in this film and only a really limited time to do so. So I'll skip to discussing the end of the film and use that to end our lecture today. So if there are any other aspects of the film that people want to explore in more depth, please bring them up in the Q&A and we can focus on them then. So for now, I want to turn to a discussion of the end of the film. So as I've said, at the end of the film, Jack Robin decides to take his father's place and chant Kol Nidre at a Lower East Side synagogue. But the movie doesn't end there. Instead, it ends with a performance by Robin at the Winter Garden, a Broadway theater where Jolson was often a headliner himself. So I'll play this performance for you now. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, it starts at about an hour and 31 minutes into the film. So this is the ending of the film.
The sun shines west, but I know where the sun shines best. Mammy, Mammy, my heartstrings are tangled around Alabama. I'm a-coming. Sorry, I made you wait. I'm coming. I hope and trust I'm not late. Mammy, Mammy, I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles. Oh, my Mammy, oh, Mammy, my little Mammy. The sun shines east, the sun shines west, but I know where the sun shines best. It's on my Mammy I'm talking about, nobody else's, my little Mammy. My heartstrings are tangled around Alabama. Mammy, I'm coming. I hope I didn't make you wait. Mammy, I'm coming. Oh, God, I hope I'm not late. Mammy, don't you know me? It's a little baby. I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles. Oh, my me.
Okay, so before I go into some things I want to talk about the ending, I'm curious to hear if any of you have any sort of reactions, questions, comments about what you just saw.
There's a lot to take in.
Lots to take in.
There's so there's a few things. A couple of people are commenting on just it being sort of difficult to process how racist it is.
Right.
That there's a one person, Betty Ruth, points out that when she was younger, she enjoyed the movie and didn't even realize until she came to Penn how racist the movie is, and that someone else comments that the context that you've offered is very helpful for this.
Yeah, the experience of watching this film today is very different than it would have been back then. And it is a very jarring thing to watch now, or at least I find it very jarring to watch now, definitely.
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of other topics being raised. One is Larry is suggesting that we look at the poster on the left that you're showing right now. So I think raising this relationship once again between the singer and his mother.
Yeah, I wanted to show two different posters to show that there are different ways of viewing the film and also different ways of marketing the film and thinking about the different resonances it has in popular culture, definitely.
And then on a little bit of a different note, Betty Ruth also pointed out, I think in relation to depictions of the ghetto or of Jews as very traditional or as having a certain kind of persona, that some Jewish Americans in the South, counting yourself among them, were really embarrassed by films like this and depictions of Jews in the ghetto. Southern Jews most often would say, we are the same as other people, we're not like those.
So one of the really interesting things that raises is that sort of films like this make it seem like there's one sense of what Jewish culture is or American Jewish culture is. And it was very regional. It still is today. What constitutes what it means to be American is very diverse today, as it was then. And so if you're watching this film and you're of American Jewish descent and you're in the South in the 1920s, it would be very different than in the South in the 1940s or in the North in the 1920s. And I think that's a really great point in thinking about how to view this film.
Yeah. Okay, so Seth is asking, is the dancer that the film cuts to during the song his non-Jewish girlfriend? And if so, does that signal that he's still assimilating, maintaining that relationship even after singing Kol Nidre?
Yes. So that's a really good point. So yes, that is his non-Jewish love interest, Mary. And the way the film ends sort of insinuates that he can continue to have his relationship with his mother, and that's his parents' neighbor next to her sitting in the audience, while also taking on this new role in society and also continuing to date his non-Jewish love interest. So it's like you can have the Jewish past and the American future. You can sort of seamlessly integrate these things into your identity. This is interesting because this is not the ending of the original story. So the original story, it ends with him singing Cold Nidre, and it doesn't end with the end performance. So including this is a much more happy ending, a more positive ending, and also sort of is trying to show the ways in which it's trying to mimic Al Jolson a little bit more than the story itself was. So I also want to focus before I turn to Q&A more explicitly on the role of blackface in this film, because I think it's really important to sort of focus in on the complicated nature of that. So this is one of several scenes of Jack Robin in blackface in the film. All of them are preparing for performances or performing. So it's sort of the play within the movie where blackface is featured, or preparations for the play within the movie. So this again evokes what vaudeville was like at that time, as well as Jolson's old career. But there's several ways that scholars have read these scenes over time. So one is that this was, at the time, one of the most thoroughly American art forms. And so we read it as problematic, and they read it as American. So it was a way to become American by taking on this art form. There are ways in which we can critique that, obviously, but I'm just going to lay out a couple of different ways to think about it. Another is that some have argued that this was a way for especially Jewish and other ethnic entertainers to earn a sense of whiteness, either by masking their Jewishness, so physically masking their Jewishness, or by taking on the racist and racializing categories of the surrounding society. So by being racist, they could prove their whiteness and their Americanness. Others saw it as a sense of sort of recognition or a nostalgia between Jewish identity and African-American identity. The idea that some people argue that Jewish minstrels in specific wanted to highlight some sense that like the pain of the Jewish past, however they are interpreting that, and the pain of the African-American past, however they're interpreting that, have some sort of connection. And you can see that in the music and in the performances. So there are things to critique about that, but there are also interesting valences about American Jewish culture that raises. So I'll leave that to you to think about. And I think those are the main things that I want to talk about at the end. The idea that it shows how blackface is central to this movie and thinking about this movie, and it shows various different complicated facets about this movie and American Jewish culture and American popular culture. So now I want to open up the discussion either to other elements of the film that you want to discuss or any other questions or comments that came up along the way. So if there's anything else you want to explore in our last 8 minutes together, please type it into the chat.
Okay, so while people are doing that, just following up on what you just said, it is really, it's striking and very intense in that final scene, how he's in blackface and so removed from his kind of self, his own persona, and yet the connection with the mother is so direct. Like the mothers and the girlfriend are both relating to his words as though they're really, really sincere an expression of his own self. So there's that kind of doubleness.
Right, there's a real complexity there. The idea that blackface in some ways allows him to escape his Jewish past, but it's also very present there in how we're supposed to read this scene because his mother is right there in the audience. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so a few comments are in from what we were talking about before. People still talking about the sexualization and the idea of being a safe romantic character or not. Richard points out that that the blackface and the connection with the non-Jewish girlfriend, all of that scene also raises the hyper-sexualization caricature of America. So that's just playing a role in the way that's dramatized. There's also, there's some discussion about the white gloves in blackface. I don't know if you know anything about that, Ayelet, but people are wondering what's the origin of white gloves as part of blackface, and perhaps they have something to do with being a barrier against the taboo of touch, or if there's some other element.
So I've heard a couple of different arguments. Usually, like other forms of popular culture, there are multiple interpretations here. Often what I've heard is something about sort of highlighting the artifice of blackface, that for white performers, it was a way to sort of highlight the fact that there is a white person underneath the blackface performance. So it's supposed to be sort of distancing the performer from the thing they are performing, is one thing that I've heard a lot.
And then there may also be just a practical thing, and Betty Ruth says it's just so they didn't have to blacken their white hands. That would be
another interesting way to read it. And usually there's often a practical understanding of things that we sort of put different kinds of significance on. That's definitely a good point.
don't have any other comments yet. Let's see. There's really a lot to process and think about. It may not be easy to kind of boil it down into
Sure.
into chat today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so there is a question, and Richard points out that there's an implicit question at the end of whether he's going to sing at subsequent Kol Nidres, or whether that was a kind of final appearance to satisfy his father, who's now out of the picture, and now he's moved on to a different scenario where the mother, as someone pointed out, is now matched with the more Americanized neighbor, and he's got this non-Jewish girlfriend. So does it actually signal a move away from, rather than a reconciliation with?
It's a good question, yeah. And they leave it there so you can sort of interpret in whichever way you choose, yeah.
Right, so Jewish sons wouldn't actually call their mother Mammy. That's part of that, taking on that blackface persona.
And also that was a very popular song that Al Jolson performed in his own career. And so it's also evoking that. So they have the mother there, and so they're using it to further the plot, but it is not a song that originates in this movie.
Okay, so Larry is pointing out that Henry Ford was not right about Jewish actors, naming some that were Jewish among the early sound movies.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think Henry Ford's rhetoric was not necessarily based in truth ever, and that's definitely one of them too. The idea that he was trying to evoke this sense that Jews sort of take things that other people produce and do things with them. And so the idea of sort of making it seem as if there are no Jewish actors is sort of part of sort of furthering that argument, as opposed to being based in any sort of historical truth, definitely. Right,
the notion that Jews are part of management and administration and never actual production is a classic idea. So Betty Ruth is just asking for clarification when the film was made again. You said it was 1927?
Yeah, 1927.
I think we may have reached the end.
Okay, well, thank you all for engaging in this with me. I know this is a complex topic to dig into, so I appreciate it.
A chance to think this through together, and yeah, thank you, Ayelet, and thank everybody for being here. We have one session remaining only, sadly. Next week, same time, same channel.
All right, I look forward to seeing you all then.
Bye.